Greetings, friends of liberty. I did want to mention, in passing, that what a Danish visitor to London said recently, that the sum total of English cuisine consists in 17 kinds of meat, is mistaken. No, the sum total of English cuisine consists rather in 73 kinds of meat. But if we English want something more refined on occasion, such as a soufflé or a delicate soupe à l'oignon, we have at hand many French recipes arriving daily, brought by the aristos and their chefs fleeing the revolution. 'Tis an ill wind indeed that does no one any good. Now you might ask, what are some of these 73 kinds? Allow me. Besides beef and swine, of course, all manner of fowl are commonly consumed. Pigeon, delectable with a strong side dish, such as red cabbage. That game bird from the wilds of America, the turkey, having arrived with his kinfolk in the 16th century, and often served with the winter vegetables such as parsnips. The mallard, delectable and crispy, dripping with its yellow fat, and eaten with rice or stuffing. Black and red grouse, served either with a savory spinach or alternately with blackberries and raspberries. Skylark, the little morsel's flesh almost melting in one's mouth when gently roasted. Goose, of course, served customarily with cranberry sauce. Pheasant, its delicate white meat, accompanied with rosemary butter and perhaps a simple baguette. The grey partridge, exquisite with sautéed mushrooms. And finally, that common barnyard fowl, the poulard, capable of virtually an infinite variety of preparation. Now these are just a partial listing of the fowl consumed, and I shan't detain you many longer with a more extensive compilation. However, I attribute our abundant English health and vitality precisely to our availing ourselves without hesitation of all forms of animal flesh at every opportunity. Now if we turn to the issue of the eating of meat in your own 20th and 21st centuries in America, I was astonished when I first arrived here in Doctor Who's TARDIS that there are nutritionists and food scientists who argue that animal meats and fats are bad for one's health. I certainly expected a greater degree of nutritional knowledge in your day and age. To combat these odd notions, we have today Nina Teicholz and her New York Times best-selling Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. Teicholz, longtime freelance journalist and graduate of Stanford and Oxford, spent 9 years reviewing thousands of academic studies, interviewing hundreds of scientists, and presents her conclusions in this easily readable and contrarian blockbuster. She began her own odyssey of nutritional discovery as a vegetarian in the 1990s, but then, giving herself a little dietary leeway to try the Mediterranean diet, added olive oil and fish, and found that eating these rich, earthy dishes was a revelation. They were complex and remarkably satisfying. I ate with abandon, and yet bizarrely I found myself losing weight. In fact, I soon lost the 10 pounds that had dogged me for years, and my doctor told me my cholesterol numbers were fine. I might have thought no more about it had my editor at Gourmet not asked me to write a story about trans fats. And thus began her research. Just as anthropologists and early world travelers have long noted, she presents us with the undeniable fact that many tribes around the world, before adopting Western culinary and dietary habits, were noted for their excellent health. In the case of the Eskimos, for example, they ate fish, meat, and fat of all kinds, such as fish eggs and caribou fat, with total fat content being 50 to 80% of calories.
In the case of the Samburu tribe in Africa, 2 to 7 liters of milk each day and 2 to 4 pounds of meat, their cholesterol consumption being off the charts. Nonetheless, the Eskimo and Samburu were largely free of heart disease and healthy. What the Eskimos avoided was lean meat. They let their dogs have it. As she summarizes, the anthropological record is full of accounts of humans finding animals during the season when they were at their fattest and then eating the fattest parts of the animal. Enter Ansel Keys, a nutritionally shape-shifting biologist and pathologist at the University of Minnesota. At his lab, he ran experiments studying cholesterol and saturated fats and wanted to understand what was causing the high serum cholesterol and heart attacks. Keys decided upon a few inconclusive tests that it must likely be the total fat in the diet. He's saying, no other variable besides the fat calories in the diet shows anything like a consistent relationship to the mortality rate from coronary or degenerative heart disease. He made a chart which seemed to illustrate this. Keys, however, also realized the strength of the anthropological data, and so, by the mid-1950s, was beginning to back away from his idea that total fat was the principal cause. Instead, he pinned the problem of increasing American arteriosclerosis and heart attacks now on saturated fat, and even published an equation claiming that the exact amount of serum cholesterol could be calculated depending upon the amount of saturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, and cholesterol eaten. He also published a 6-country study claiming to show that increasing fat calories led to increasing heart disease. However, opposing researchers responded by publishing a graph adding 16 more countries, which now in total showed no correlation. Could it be that a government scientist was cherry-picking his data? Keys, for his part, responded by doing a more complete 7-country study published in 1970, which appeared to show that, although Finnish lumberjacks and Greek farmers were eating roughly the same total amount of fat, it was the type of fat, saturated fat, that mattered. One problem, however, was that overall deaths were not lower among those consuming low amounts of saturated fat. It was interesting, too, that Keys published most of the data in a Dutch journal, Voting, where he knew it would go unnoticed. In addition, being an epidemiological study, it could only show correlation, but not causation. Nonetheless, Keys continued widely broadcasting his claim that eating saturated fat leads to high cholesterol, and that high cholesterol leads to heart disease. Some scientists then and later questioned those assumptions. For example, Peter Ahrens, who started finding evidence that it was mainly carbs, not fats which cause obesity and heart disease. Another was George Mann, who had done studies among the Maasai of Africa and who said, for a generation, research on heart disease had been more political than scientific. A third example was that of Swedish scientist Uffe Ravenskov, who at a packed conference in Copenhagen that the author attended asked, the whole pathway from cholesterol in the diet to cholesterol in the blood to heart disease, has this pathway really been proven? The response among the conference attendees, 100+ scientists wagged their heads in unison. Next question, asked an irritated moderator. All these dietary heretics suffered severe professional setbacks because they disagreed with the conventional wisdom, losing jobs, funding, invitations to speak, journal access, and other benefits. And their experiments continued to be ignored. 3 iconic American institutions that perpetuated and backstopped this faulty theory, called the diet-heart hypothesis, were the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, B, the American Heart Association, the AHA, and C, the National Heart Institute, the NIHI. In combination, they controlled most of the money for research grants, which in the case of the NHI, by 1995, totaled $1.5 billion annually. Not surprisingly, influential publications such as Time magazine and the New York Times, James Brody, there being notable, simply repeated their falsehoods. The New York Times said in 1962, for example, that whereas people once thought of dairy products in terms of health and vitality, many people now associate them with cholesterol and heart ailments. Nonetheless, the contrary evidence kept piling up. From an Indian railway worker sampling 1 million workers, to a study of Italians eating their fatty prosciutto and lard fried food in Pennsylvania, to a meta-study looking at all men free from heart disease, which found that their fat consumption varied wildly, from about 7% of total calories among Benedictine monks and the Japanese to 65% among Somalis. Important as any study was the Framingham Heart Study, published in 1961, which initially appeared to find that total cholesterol was correlated with increased heart disease. However, when later data points in a follow-up study 30 years later were gathered, those with cholesterol in the mid-range had a greater risk of heart attack death than those with higher cholesterol. In addition, for each 1% drop of cholesterol, there was an 11% increase in coronary and total mortality. Teicholz adds that not until 1992, in fact, did a Framingham study leader publicly acknowledge the study's findings on fat. This study leader, William Cassell, admitting, in Framingham, the more saturated fat one ate, the lower the person's serum cholesterol, and they weighed the least. Clearly, in the NIH's mind, the science was already settled. Given that old-fashioned fats, such as butter, suet, and lard, were now demonized, the logical alternatives were polyunsaturated fats, such as those found in margarine and vegetable oils, like Wesson and Mazola. As an ad proclaimed, polyunsaturates are the plus in Mazola. As a result of this constant media and advertisement barrage, the percentage of total calories in vegetable oils rose from 0 to 8% by the turn of the 21st century. All the while, the intake of overall fats went down by 7%. Given that polyunsaturates are naturally unstable oils, since their multiple double bonds all can react with air, oxidizing quickly, the discovery of how to hydrogenate these oils, hardening them, was crucial in their commercialization. Hydrogenization allows their use in many baking products, making them softer and more crumbly, flaky, and moist. What no one really noticed the harm of, was that trans fats were introduced in the process. On the academic front, further large studies, such as the so-called Mr. Fit study run by Jeremiah Stamler, an ally of Ansel Keys, were a disaster for the diet-heart hypothesis. Although men in the intervention group had been spectacularly successful in changing their diets, quitting smoking, and reducing their blood pressure, they died at slightly higher rates than the controls. Nonetheless, as usual, the results were ignored. Notable here was that follow-up studies 16 years later even found higher rates of lung cancer. This recalls the results of the Framingham Heart Study, which found that men with cholesterol levels below 190 were 3 times more likely to get colon cancer than men with cholesterol greater than 220. When Teicholz questioned Stamler, Keyes' ally, about these findings, he didn't remember them. How convenient. I would note here that in England, with the medical journal Lancet leading the way, the debate was more lively and open than it was in the United States, and skepticism and even hostility toward the diet-heart hypothesis were widespread. Why the difference? Teicholz argues that the low-cholesterol diet became the national policy, not only because the American Heart Association and nutritionists enthusiastically endorsed it, but even more importantly, because the vast power of the U.S. government swung behind it. With its massive bureaucracies, Washington is the very opposite of that kind of place where skepticism so essential to good science, can survive. Then, in 1977, the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs and a staffer named Nick Motern, who later opened a vegan restaurant, wrote a report approving polyunsaturated fats. The astonishing result was the dietary guidelines that emerged from this committee, called the Dietary Goals, compiled by one interested layperson, Motern, without any formal review, became arguably the most influential document in the history of diet and disease, an entire government and then a nation following them. Did any American institutions oppose this rush to judgment against saturated fats? Only two. One was a branch of the National Academy of Sciences, its Food and Nutrition Board, and the other was the American Academy of Pediatrics. And it was good that they did, since children on such low-fat diets had been turning up in hospitals showing failure to thrive. But sadly, in the end, even the AAP's resistance to the low-fat diet slowly eroded. Given all this faulty advice, Americans started eating more carbs to avoid eating fat. From 1971 to 2000, consumption of carbohydrates increased by nearly 25%. This was accompanied by the Snackwell phenomenon, where people would chow down on low-fat snacks, rationalizing that these couldn't make one fat, as if a caloric surplus didn't matter. Another result, giving the knee-jerk demonization of especially animal fat and cholesterol, was the delayed recognition that good cholesterol, HDL, is highly beneficial. As Teicholz says, people with low HDL cholesterol levels had an 8 times higher rate of heart attacks than did people with high HDL cholesterol levels. Now entered the Mediterranean diet, becoming popular in the 1990s. As Teicholz says, mainstream nutrition experts simply could not fathom how these fat-guzzling Greeks could possibly be so healthy. One reason was that olive oil, being monounsaturated instead of polyunsaturated, that is, having only one double bond instead of many, is relatively stable. Nonetheless, even with its good qualities, she describes how the whole nutrition and olive oil industry went gaga on this diet, partially because many European governments subsidized and funded conference trips to delightful vacation resort destinations in Greece, Italy, and Spain. For all these reasons, olive oil consumption today is 3 times what it was in 1990. Teicholz argues that another reason the Med diet may be as healthy as it is simply because it doesn't include much sugar. As the book proceeds, Teicholz talks about other harmful consequences of this government-funded and controlled science. A, how fast food restaurants substituted partially hydrogenated vegetable oil for beef tallow and palm oil in their deep-fried products, with the result that, since these oxidized oils are difficult to clean, collected clothing is sometimes spontaneously combusted in trucks, dryers, and even after being folded. B, how a damaging campaign was conducted by associations such as the American Soybean Association and vegetable oil companies against various tropical oils containing high amounts of saturated fat, such as palm oil and coconut oil. Despite being likely healthier than corn, soybean, and canola oil, these were in effect driven from American stores. C, how it appears regulatory capture occurred with the FDA, with the fats and oils groups even hiring its presidents straight out of the FDA legal office. D, how the role of what are called confounding factors, unaccounted variables like exercise, vitamins, sugar, and lifestyle, likely influence many nutritional studies. And E, how many different low or no-carb diets now exist. In addition, while giving us the history of nutrition research, the bureaucracies and institutions controlling it, and the public's reactions, she also talks about various prominent figures in the field of nutrition. A, Dean Ornish, another low-fat vegetarian guru. B. Walter Willett, the Harvard nutritionist who popularized the Mediterranean diet and said on ABC News that margarine kills 30,000 people a year. Fred Kummerow, rebel scientist, another pioneer in discovering how harmful trans fats are, who was shut out of the AHA. D. Robert Atkins, one of the famous book, Robert Atkins' Diet Revolution, whose signature diet plan was more or less the USDA pyramid turned on its head. E. And finally, Gary Taubes, who was one of the first to comprehensively criticize the diet-heart hypothesis. To conclude, reviewing this comprehensive book, which I would give an A minus. Number one, her arguments about the relative harmlessness and even beneficialness of saturated fats and animal meats are convincing, as are her cautions about the harmfulness of polyunsaturated fats. Number two, Stanford epidemiologist John Ioannidis in 2005 in a paper entitled Why Most Public Research Findings Are False argued precisely that. And his paper and other reports go to the heart of the issue of the decline or great inefficiency of Western scientific institutions. Teicholz's book is here highly supportive in showing over the last century how inferior American nutrition science has been. What's the reason? Governmental funding and involvement at every level, which has had the effect of creating nutrition ideologies supported by subsidized cliques of scientists, nonprofit organizations, and medical bureaucracies. This mirrors the rise of woke and other ideologies in the humanities which have the same cause. The cure? Privatize everything, eliminate all government funding, tax subsidies that go to these nonprofits and private universities, and abolish all the corresponding bureaucracies like the NIH, the FDA, the USDA, and others which represent a huge yet largely unrecognized harm. Number three, she lauds author Gary Taubes, but I'm not a fan of his, given that ketogenic and very low-carb diets have completely failed in my own case, and without question in the case of many others. One of the most effective weight and fat loss methods for me has been simply taking small amounts of honey during the day, which reduction in calories delivers a caloric deficit while still maintaining enough energy so I'm not exhausted. You can find many cogent criticisms of Taubes online by, for example, Michael Fumento at Reason, and even the somewhat foul-mouthed Australian Anthony Culpo, and by the many scientists such as Stanford's John Farquhar and Gerald Reaven, who they say Taubes quoted them out of context. The dietary reality is, contrary to Taubes' nonsensical arguments that all obesity is endocrinological, that there were no fat people at Auschwitz, and virtually no professional athletes use his or Dr. Atkins's low-carb diets. Very happy for my part to live in the 18th century, where the government, in its wisdom and respect for our individual sovereignty, understands how utterly alien it would be to regulate what its citizens eat. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.